What's happening there, peeps? What's new with you? Not a whole lot with me, just the same routine. Going to work, buying crypto, taking care of my kid, dealing with all that life throws at me. The crypto market has had a little bit of a jolt, which is nice, because for a long time it looked like it was never coming back. But I knew that it would, and it has moved, so it's still alive. Whatever it is, it's probably not all it's cracked up to be. Today, I'm going to go into part 2 of Anthony Burgess's The Wanting Seed. I think the very first time that I talked about it was in episode 2, and then I had a stream a little while back, episode 12. So I think I first introduced it in episode 2, and then I did a little analysis of it, and on episode 12 I started at the beginning. And so this will be officially, part 2 of that. And what is this now? Episode 20. So we're moving along. And I tried to gauge it by every, after the first 10 episodes, I sort of reevaluated the way I was doing things. And I brought some new books in, and then revisited some of the old. And I tried to stay very close to the sort of method of reading off my notes for the most part, and I will do that today as well. But I think pretty soon I want to kind of go off a little bit on my own, like maybe in the next episode or two, and just speak a little bit more off the cuff, maybe on either some of the books I've already done or just books that I'm reading at the time. Eventually I'd like to make it a little bit more of a stream of consciousness thing, like it started out to be. I think I was calling it stream of unconsciousness. Because although I would speak extemporaneously, quite often I would sort of forget what I was talking about, or be less able to access certain data from my memory. I was having a little bit of a log jam there. And every now and then, files get corrupted, or maybe I've got too much stored on the desktop and I need to go through and back things up and delete certain files. I'm talking about my brain, not my computer. So anyway, so I'm going to go through The Wanting Seed, and I think with this episode we'll be up to like chapter 6, something to that effect. And maybe I'll talk a little bit more later about some other things. So, where are we at here? Okay, so I'll just jump right into it. To sort of recap on episode 12, the book starts out in the hospital where the infant son of Beatrice Joanna and Tristram Fox had just died. Tristram wasn't present. He had to work. But Beatrice Joanna was there, speaking with the doctors. She was in a sort of shock, not only by the affect of having just lost her son, but also by the blatant indifference of the doctor, the nurses, the receptionist, and everyone else in the room. So in this future dystopia, as it's illustrated, child death is not encouraged to be mourned. On the contrary, with environmentalist and Malthusian matters being of prominent concern, propaganda discouraging procreation abounds. And so presently, some men have arrived to pick up the body for processing into chemical fertilizers, which will be used to help the environment. And everywhere can be seen the advertisements, PSAs, and such propaganda promoting birth control, sterilization, castration, homosexuality, TRANS, and abortion. There is an instituted one-child policy, and if a child dies, that's it. No more children for you. Under the auspices of population control, the majority of childbearing is rendered by the lower classes. But despite all of these circumstances and social conditioning, Beatrice Joanna finds herself of an older mindset and disillusioned by the mores of her time. The death of her son has aroused an emotional revulsion towards all these conditions. It all felt very alien to her, and she anachronistic towards it. And so she was culture shocked in her own time. And this is a common occurrence in dystopian fiction. If you think about Winston in 1984, he seems to have an awakening. It isn't explicitly stated that he has been averse to his milieu from a young age. As the book begins, it seems as though he is coming to certain realizations, and with each instance, he becomes more and more aware of his alienation. And very much like the psychedelic experience, coincident with the awakening itself is the immediate environmental response to the awakening, where attention from others is sort of drawn to his awareness, and he has to conceal it to the best of his ability. Then there is Bernard from Brave New World, and the recalcitrance of Bernard arouses the suspicion of his friends and his boss. His position at work is threatened by his dangerous ideas. It's almost as if these characters are unable to be lied to. They have a seemingly innate allergic reaction to the bullshit. And I can relate to this as well. I remember, like right around 7th grade, and whenever something goofy would come around, some new trend or fad, some catchy phrase, and everybody else was doing it, I would just sort of look around and go, what a bunch of dumbasses. And it kept me out of the inner circles. The friends I did have, we were always just on the outside kind of judging. While smoking cigarettes, of course. So, we weren't completely immune. So these characters, and not only the protagonists, sometimes they have an accomplice, even if a traitorous one, are able to see through the facade, or rather not be able not to. So Beatrice Joanna, she storms out of the doctor's office and down the hall towards the elevator. And she gets in, along with a lesbian couple. And a few floors down, they are joined by a cross-dressing man. And as these characters are going about their overt business, the couple is sort of making out, and the man is touching up his lipstick in the mirror. She has a pang of grief, and out loud she laments her son's passing. That poor, poor boy, she says, drawing the attention and eliciting chortles from the others. And she sort of spits back at them, in her own way, condemning their degeneracy, which nearly leads to an altercation. She goes out on the street, marveling at the strangeness of every instance, and detail of modern society writ large. Every aspect of what she sees as wrong with the world can be seen at a moment's glance from her present vantage point. Billboards, pedestrian traffic, very few automobiles, a few little shuttles and taxis, overrepresentation of immigrants, nobody interacting, everyone atomized and just trying to get somewhere. And she was beginning to see the first hints of people in uniform, a nascent police state of the interface, which we will go into here in a minute. Quite symbolically, she walks against the pedestrian traffic, down to the water's edge near the pier, and marvels that the ocean is the only thing left representing real life, and thinks briefly that she wishes her son could have been buried at sea because it held the only real potential for truth. So that's about where I left off the last time. And actually I left off with Tristram teaching his class about Pelagianism versus Augustinianism, and how the national political system, subsumed into each individual, moved in a circle, like a clock divided into 3 phases as a sort of zeitgeist in flux. It was as if the evolution through the phases was set in motion at some point, and it just followed its own logical course over and over again. Or was it something that was maintained throughout by external control? I don't recall whether or not this part of it was explicitly stated in the book, maybe later on. I read this book a long time ago. However, all aspects along the course reflected something within each one of us, inside of our very nature, and we all go along because it's unavoidable. So instead of you being a liberal and I being a conservative, we all move in tandem. And so this week we're Pelagians, and in 4 months we'll all be Augustinians after an intermediate phase. And we're all both God and the devil, but not at the same time. Because only Mr. Live Dog can be that. And who is Mr. Live Dog? Well, he's a fictional symbol from the adventures of Mr. Live Dog from Cosmicomic. He's described as a big, funny, flubsy demiurge who, Supplementandus, spawned unwanted life all over the earth. So overpopulation was his doing. And in none of his adventures did he ever win. Mr. Homo, his human boss, always brought him to heel. But now, the theology subsisting in the opposed doctrines of Pelagianism and Augustinianism no longer holds any validity. These symbols are merely used in a utilitarian sense, because they are suited to this particular age, which relies increasingly on perceptual images. Also, as a side note, people have all their natural teeth removed at a young age. Yet Tristram's wife, Beatrice Johanna, has all of hers. This an additional sign of her atavistic character. As he is teaching, his attention flashes fleetingly to the fate of his newly deceased son, and then he pushes on with the lesson. So, regarding the idea that every dystopian fiction features a main character who is 100% not on board with the current zeitgeist, Tristram is just now sort of waking up. He's not all the way there, but he's having scintillating doubts, which pick up steam throughout the book. I think he is more like Bernard from Brave New World, where Beatrice Joanna is more like John the Savage, completely alien to it all. If you go to community college and take Psychology 101, one of the first things they tell you is one of the signs of mental illness is not being in accord with your society. Imagine that, if you will. According to this logic, in Germany in the 1930s and early 40s, to not be in accord with the tiny mustache man followers would be to have a mental illness. And today, in America, to not go along with the woke agenda makes you a depraved and bigoted human being. So there it is. So, speaking of tiny mustache man followers, I have to give credit quite frequently, lest it be forgotten, that I do steal my algorithm training lexicon on none other than the great Jay Dyer, who has managed to avoid algorithmic loss of viewership by means of modulating his language in order to not utter certain catchphrases which might get him banned, shadow banned, or just have his viewership limited. And so I've kind of picked up on that a little bit, and if I say certain phrases that sound funny to you, or if you listen to Jay Dyer's material, if it sounds familiar, he's got his own little trip going, and I've got my own little trip going, but I've definitely learned from him to modulate the language. And so maybe in due time I'll kind of come up with my own little catchphrases for these things, but for now I just kind of use his. So as a side note, it's interesting how, according to our current university mindset, all people are equally held responsible for the time in which they lived. So if you happen to be from the antebellum South of 1830 or 1840, you would be considered guilty for all that occurred around you. All the slavery, whether you owned slaves or not. I mean, after all, if you descended from slave owners, you have been a beneficiary of slavery, right? Whether or not you approved or agreed with the practice, doesn't matter. By the same token, everybody living in America today will be held guilty for all the insanity of today's crazed leftists who seek to codify the genital mutilation of children, mass abortions, even infanticide, child drag shows, the stripping of women's sports accolades. Even if these are your sworn enemies, you will be equally held guilty among them, because you were a part of that society, and you didn't do everything you could to stop it. You weren't the first to stand up against the entire power structure, all by yourself, and condemn them to their faces. Because guess what? If you try and do that, you are the one who will be the bigot. And you will be the one sent down the memory hole, or made an example of. Remember, it was the Jews who were considered to have privilege in Germany. They held disproportionate power in finance, government, bureaucracies, and sectors of industry and banking. And look at how their image has been manipulated once again, right now. So, to the 88% of the motherfuckers back in 7th grade who were sheep following the latest gossip and are still those same people today, fuck you. Of course, the real culprits will deny ever having taken part, always maintaining their moral posturing. There will be mass cover-ups, aided and abetted by all the guilty parties, and place the blame squarely on those people who opposed it to begin with. And for the large part, they will probably succeed. Because that's the way history is written. Let us not forget who runs the institutions. Those people need to be thrown out. The sooner the better. Revolution can go both ways. So, in chapter 3, this one again features Beatrice Joanna. From the coastline where she was uttering a brief prayer to the sea, which seemed to her the only lasting reminder of abundant life and fertility, her attention was diverted to a bronze statue atop government building, a statue of Pelagius. There was a time when that spot was occupied by Augustine. Okay, remember the idea of the cycling political zeitgeist? And now the present increase of uniformed men on the ground? The statue was switched out periodically according to the prevailing universal spirit. And right next to government building was the Ministry of Infertility, displaying a bas relief of a naked, sexless figure breaking eggs. She figured she might as well pick up her condolence while she was here. She thought she might also see her brother-in-law, with whom she was having an affair. She looked upon and considered the ethnically diverse crowd which surrounded her. In 1962, when this book was written, this would not have been the typical case in London. Although it is today, that the white population would be ever decreasing. At the time, this idea was still within the realm of science fiction. So at this point in the story, ethnic divisions were no longer considered important in society. The world was rather split into language groups. Chapter 4 flashes back over to Tristram as he's instructing his class. Presently, he's speaking about the Anglo-Saxon achievement of parliamentary government, being government by party. He says, later, when it was found that the work of government could be carried out more expeditiously without debate and without the opposition that party government entailed, the nature of the cycle began to be recognized. He drew a circle on the board and divided it into 3 arcs. Here we have the Pelagian phase, or Pel phase, then the intermediate phase, or interphase, and this leads to the Augustinian phase, or Gus phase. So at this point in the story, presently, we're sort of between the Pelagian phase and the interphase. And this is part of the book where the author, instead of blandly describing all of this to the reader, just sort of works it into the dialogue. I've talked about this before, like in Brave New World, where the director of hatcheries is taking the students on a tour of the plant where the babies are produced in order to sort of describe the mundane details of how the operation goes in this Brave New World. Same thing applies here, where the professor is instructing the students on how the political system works just for the benefit of the reader. It's like a literary device. So, Pel phase, interphase, Gus phase, Pel phase, interphase, Gus phase, etc. ad infinitum. The cycle continues into perpetuity. Okay, so just a brief recap of what each phase means. A government in the Pelagian phase commits itself to the belief that man is perfectible by his own efforts, that the journey to perfection is a long, straight road, Man wants to be perfect. Man wants to be good. The citizens want to cooperate with the rulers. There is no need for devices of coercion which will force them to cooperate. Laws are necessary to some extent, yet only to point the way to an emergent pattern of social perfection. Just guidelines, basically. But from the thesis that the citizen's desire is to behave like a good social animal, it is assumed all laws will be obeyed. The Pelagian state does not think it necessary to erect an elaborate punitive apparatus. Disobey the law, and you will be told not to do it again. Or maybe fined a couple of quid, because we're in London. Your failure does not spring from original sin, and is not an essential part of the human fabric. It is a mere flaw to be shed somewhere along the road to final human perfection. And we see this today with the university mindset that you can educate people into good behavior. I mean, if this were really the case, you wouldn't find mad scientists building nuclear weapons and crooked and corrupt financial institutions and governments. In the Pell phase, the liberal ideal seems capable of fulfillment. Under this model, the acquisitive urge and brute desires are checked by a somewhat technocratic control system. The capitalist here has no place. We get state-controlled production. The state is God. The will of the citizen is subsumed under that of the state. And somehow here the citizen is working for himself? Is this liberalism? You see where this is headed. You will own nothing and you will be happy. Of course, the aspiration is somewhat ahead of the reality. And what destroys the dream? Well, eventually the governors are disappointed when they learn that men are not as good as they had supposed. Caught up in the swirl of their own illusion, they are horrified when they see people as they really are. It then becomes necessary to force people to do the right thing. Remember the COOF, what happened in Canada and Australia? So laws are reasserted. A system of enforcement is clapped together real quick. This sudden enforcement unveils a sort of pandemonium. Then irrationality and panic take over. Now consider the 2020 summer riots. Remember the summer of love? Mostly peaceful, according to the government media apparatus. When rationality goes away, brutality steps in. Then you've got Chaz Chop or whatever the fuck. At least that's how it starts, until the secret police step in. Gangs and thugs make way for not the sheriffs or the city cops, but the deep state police. National Guard, CIA, FBI, UN soldiers, etc. The surveillance state is activated, and the courts are rigged accordingly. Next thing you know, citizens on the street are having their teeth kicked in by bands of uniformed Stasi-type soldiers. Torture in the interrogation room, just like in the Gulag Archipelago. Stalinist Russia-type shit. Condemnation without trial. Pulling out the fingernails, crushing your testicles with a jackboot, bright lights in the face for hours on end, being forced to stand upright in a box for several days on end, with nothing but a pole going through it to hold on to, forced to drink salt water, starved, not being allowed to sleep for a week or more, constantly beaten, shitting in a bucket, solitary confinement, no daylight. This is the interphase. In chapter 5, we go back to Beatrice Joanna. That's Tristram's wife. So she walks into the Ministry of Infertility, the lobby of which is described as smelling like disinfectant. She makes her way into the condolences office, where the smell of disinfectant makes way for the light odor of alcohol breath, as other bereaved mothers are there waiting, some of whom are there to pick up spare income, death certificates in hand. State-condoned infanticide led to another kind of welfare program. Each mother had their own excuse, their own little story about how Billy dumped the boiling water on himself. Bobby fell out of the window when she wasn't looking. Betsy fell between the railing on the stairs. Like potheads picking up marijuana prescriptions back in the day when that kind of thing was cool. There was this guy that I sort of knew. He was a friend of a friend. And he came around one day and he told me how like he could refer me to a doctor who would prescribe me marijuana if I told him that I had depression because my mother had passed away. There was this other guy I knew, and after he got his prescription, he had told me that he had PTSD from fighting with his ex-wife. And he looked sort of bleary-eyed into the abyss of his own mind as he described the situation, just so obviously full of shit. But of course I was supposed to believe it. It's like, give up the act, dude. You already got your script. So Beatrice Joanna handed off her own child's death certificate and then went off to the central cash desk where another woman was already receiving her payout. She took her money and looked up at the Malthusian propaganda poster which read, "Don't have any more." She felt angry and lonely. White-coated workers rushed into the Department of Contraceptive Research. And then there was the propaganda department. Then she saw her paramour across the way. He was talking with another man, the stigmata of his affected Skittles garb on full display. This was her husband's brother, her lover. She observed the splendid mime of orthodox homosexual secondary social behavior. She tried to suppress an innate feeling of revulsion over the performance in light of their current tryst and what she knew about his actual sexual behavior. But he was a man headed for the top of the pyramid within the ministry. All she had to do to wreck this man's career was blow the whistle and he'd be finished. If only his superiors knew, she thought. After taking leave of his colleague, he saw her and walked over to her. She told him about the death of her son, whose body was now in the hands of the Ministry of Agriculture. They quietly and secretly made plans to meet later that afternoon. He had to be discreet in his manner. She felt like being less discreet. She spoke openly and loudly. He told her he was being watched and indicated a man on the other side of the room who appeared to be checking his watch. She demanded he say, "I love you." 3 forbidden words in this anti-love society. He silently mouthed the words and looked around self-consciously, and there they departed for the time being. So, we'll end it here. It's as good a place as any. We'll pick up later. My back hurts.